Yeah, g'day YouTubers, Spannerman again here with another video. Hope you enjoy the video today. Please subscribe to the channel. Any comments, thumbs up. Thanks for watching. Bye for now. Yeah, g'day YouTubers, Spannerman again here with another video. Today we're going to talk about the 10 degrees downward tilt because a few people have been writing in the comments that could I explain what is the main purpose of the 10 degrees downward tilt and how can the wood benefit from the 10 degrees downward tilt. So fair enough, I can understand that. Some people are not too familiar with it, and you've got still not using it much these days, and a lot of other companies recommend it and some don't. So, you know, I can understand the confusion with some people out there going, well, why do I want to use it? What's the benefit of it, you know? And a lot of the times, like, still just don't tell you anything about it. Getting information out of still is almost impossible. So a lot of times it's trial and error. First of all, where would you use a full chisel as opposed to a semi-chisel? Well, typically I use full chisels most of the time in all my cutting. Why? Because full chisels are more aggressive and cut faster through the timber. The downside is that if not sharpened properly, they will go blunt much quicker. If done properly, using the right timber, when I say using the right timber, if you sharpen it to the timber, the conditions, it'll work fine. So what do I mean by that? Okay, I live in Australia. We've got eucalypts, very hard timber. Grey box, I've got a lot of grey box that I cut. It's one of the hardest eucalypts out there. Around about 15.6 on the Janka scale. What's the Janka scale, you ask? Well, roughly it's a ball bearing about half an inch in diameter, and they put a load on it so that the ball bearing goes about halfway into the timber. And then they measure the scale. So that's called the Janka scale, and grey box is 15 kilonewtons, so 15,000 newtons. It's quite a lot of force to push that ball bearing halfway in the timber. But in other countries, over in Europe, where they've got birch, pine, some of the ash, a lot of these are very soft timbers, and they're lucky if they hit 5 on the Janka scale. So, you know, we're pushing more than 3 times the hardness than a lot of other people. So therefore, you have to understand that sharpness for us, or here in Australia, it can be totally different than what people are used to overseas with soft timber. Because I can tell you one thing right now, if you're cutting pine, you could almost cut that with any type of chain and it'd be half blunt and it'll still cut. And when you get hardwood, I've even seen sparks come off the wood that hard. An old stump was laying out in the paddock. And I thought, oh, this is great timber, fantastic burning. And the stump was horizontal. And I put the chainsaw into it horizontal, and I saw sparks fly off it. And I couldn't believe what I saw. The first time in my... I've seen it a few times, but it's only if the timber is weathered and it's hard as a rock. But, yeah, it does happen. So this is the thing with a full chisel. If you're hand filing your chain and you're hand filing full chisel, and you have to make sure that you're using the correct file. If you're not using the correct file, you can find out that the file goes into the tooth a little bit and creates a bit of a beak, like a parrot beak. If you get a bit of a parrot beak on your chainsaw tooth on a full chisel, this can be damaged very easily in hardwood, and it can even bend over slightly. So it is critical that you are aware of that, and if you are using hardwood, I would recommend that you use 10 degrees downward tilt. So what does 10 degrees downward tilt? A lot of people say, well, okay, if a file is sitting at horizontal and you drop it down a little bit, how does that help anything? Well, it actually does, and we'll demonstrate that as best as possible, and hopefully for those people may be able to understand what that means. So if we hold this file as horizontal as what I can, you will notice that the gap in here, well, there is no gap virtually. It's equal, but if I drop the file down 10 degrees, and I'll bring the camera just over here, you should notice that there's a little bit of a gap. I've got to try and get in the right spot so that you see that. I think you can see that little tiny gap at the back if I drop it down 10 degrees. Little tiny gap there. Now, if you continue filing, because of that tiny gap, it means that the file is not touching the back of the tooth, so it's going to start touching the front of the tooth. So you're going to start filing the front of the tooth before. If I pull the chain out, you might be able to see it better. So if we put the file into a tooth there, and that's fairly horizontal, and we drop down 10 degrees, you can see that gap. And then if you start to file forward, you're going to file the front of the tooth and not the back of the tooth until that file comes level and parallel with the tooth. So you'll create a compounded bevel. You already had a compounded bevel anyway, so you're just going to change a slight angle. You're going to reduce this point. It won't be as pointy. You'll take it off. Might be able to demonstrate it even on this tooth. See whether you can see that. So if the file is level and we drop it down, can you see how the back of the tooth is exposed? The metal now does not touch the file up the top. You're going to have to refile this tooth, and you'll file away the front before the file comes in contact with the back. You may take a 0.5 millimetre off a standard 3/8 tooth, and by doing that, you'll start to remove a little bit of metal from the front. When you remove a little bit of metal from the front and the C shape here is not as defined, it reduces the metal on the front but gives more support to the tooth underneath. So this point becomes a little bit stronger. If you've got too much of a beak on there, this point is a lot weaker, and in really hard wood it can bend. You may not be able to see it with your eyes very clearly, but if it moves 1 or 2 degrees at the front, 1 millimetre, and it starts to bend down, well, you're not going to cut. It's going to be using it like it's a blunt, and that's as simple as what I can get, and that's the advantage of the 10 degrees downward tilt. It gives more strength to the working corner of the full chisel, and by giving more strength to the working corner, it'll stay sharper longer if it's not as pointy. And that's why I always prefer to use 25 degrees top plate angle. So, not 30 degrees. So, this is the top plate angle here. And this is why we refer to it as a compounded bevel, because you've got one angle here and you've got another angle, the face. This is your 60 degree angle here that's created right on that face there. So, avoid 30 degrees and especially 35 degrees if you're using or cutting hardwood, and use your 10 degrees downward tilt. So what I have done on this particular chain here, this is just a little bit of chain that's off a 100-foot roll. And it's full chisel, so I proceeded to file it horizontal, then I proceeded to file it with a 10 degrees downward tilt so that you could see that. And then I went exaggerated using a slightly smaller file, a 4.7 millimetre file, and put way too much hook on there, and illustrated what can happen to that tooth when there's too much damage. Too much hook. How easy it is to damage it. And I just sort of touched it with a nylon hammer and it bent real, fairly easy. So what we'll try and do is have a look at a tooth that has no 10 degrees downward tilt. And there it is there. You can see that C shape. Then if you look at the next tooth, you can see that the C shape is not as defined, especially up the top there. There's less hook. You can certainly see that hook now. This would be okay in soft timber. You wouldn't have a problem. In really hard timber, you could damage the point maybe. Whereas this has got more support. And this is much more suitable in hardwood. So what you're seeing now is what you should be, that's the profile that you need when you're in hardwood. Now, in the next tooth, I deliberately used a smaller file, a 4.7, created a large beak, and I just touched it with a nylon hammer, and it bent so easily. And what I can do is, even if we hit this with a nylon hammer, it probably won't even do much. So we'll just have a look. We'll just come over here. And what I want to do is illustrate what I did on that other one. So we hit that one. It's done nothing. And this one I could probably hit as hard as I wanted to. And it hasn't done a thing. So, as you can see there, hasn't bent it. We'll just try and refocus there. As you can see, hitting that with a hammer done nothing. And it certainly didn't do anything to that one. And I used the same hammer to hit this. So it was just a matter, and even if I do it again, have a look at that. That won't cut. So, I've got 3 examples. And we'll just recap. This is without 10 degrees downward tilt. It can take a fair bit of abuse, and most likely you won't bend the end over. There is a possibility on certain hardwoods that you might. If you have a 10 degrees downward tilt, you'll have less hook, or less beak, and you certainly won't damage that hitting hardwood. And this is the extreme. So this was to prove a point that if you file or use the wrong file and you get too much of a beak or hook, and it gets a bit of pressure by hitting the hardwood, it can bend over like that quite easily. So hopefully that explains to people what the advantage is on 10 degrees downward tilt. As I said, depends on how you file. Hopefully you're using the right file. If you use on a 3/8 chain, you can quite easily use a 5.5mm file, and even if you file horizontal, you'll get less hook. But as the tooth wears down about halfway, you should drop back to a 5.2mm file. A lot of people recommend a 5.5mm file for 3/8 chain. Some companies do, some companies don't. Still don't recommend 5.5mm. They just stick with 5.2. But it's quite, it's not an issue or a problem using a 5.5mm file on a 3/8 chain. Once that tooth wears about halfway down, the taper of the tooth, the height of the tooth will get smaller. Swap to a 5.2mm file, and you'll find out that your hook won't be too bad at all. And even if you don't have to go 10 degrees downward tilt, you can just lower it a little bit. You could be 5 or 6 degrees downward tilt. And that's just going to give, it's going to reduce the hook a little bit. So, and it just gives the protection of damage. And I've seen it before on many times that if you have a slight bit of hook and you're working on really old hardwood, that you can slightly damage that tooth. Now, the other thing is also, remember this, as I spoke before, if when you do have a more beak and more hook, as indicated in this particular one, you'll, I don't know whether you can see it, but it becomes too pointy. It's too much of a point, way too much of a point, and the strength is reduced because it gets too thin. Because that's the other thing. When you create a bit of a hook, this leading edge here becomes very thin. Hopefully you can actually see that. You see that shelf? It's very thin. Whereas if you actually look at the shelf, okay, so that's 10 degrees downward tilt. Look at the difference. Can you see how this trailing edge, this edge right on the top here, has got much more metal support underneath? And you'll also find that the top plate cutting angle is because using the wrong file, it's way out. Everything's just so bad about that tooth. And as I said in the beginning, yes, it will cut. But I can tell you what, probably about after a minute of using the chainsaw, it'll be blunt. And then you'll be going, oh, that didn't work too good. Anyway, hopefully I've addressed that problem with the 10 degrees downward tilt. It takes no effort whatsoever to lower your file down a little bit when you're filing, so it's not even an issue to do that, and there is a benefit from it. And the two biggest benefits is that the tooth will, because it's got more support of metal underneath where the shelf is, it should last longer. So hopefully with 25 degrees top plate angle and a 10 degrees downward tilt, you'll find that the metal underneath the shelf is more supported. The life of the cutting of the tooth will last a lot longer if it's done that way. Normally I would probably be able to use the chain for a good 1.5 hours, 2 hours, if it's done properly. If it's not done properly, 10 minutes and you're going to have to sharpen it again. That's the difference. So hopefully I've opened the eyes of a few people. As I said, all you have to do is lower, make sure you're using the right file, and make sure that you lower it anywhere from 5 to 10 degrees, and you'll find out that it will certainly cut very good, and it will last a lot longer if that edge is, the top plate angle is about 25 degrees. In hardwood. In softwood, you can just about get away with anything. You could get away with 35 degrees. You could get away with not running, even having a little bit of a hook on there, because soft timber won't pose a problem to the tooth, but hard timber will. And if you remembered earlier, I was saying the Janka scale is around about 15.7 for some of our Aussie hardwood, whereas overseas in Europe, the Janka scale's only around about 4s to 5s. Obviously, there's harder timber in Europe, but typically here there is no such thing as softwood except for pine. Most people don't cut pine. If you order wood here for your heater, most people get red gum or grey box or iron bark or stringy bark. All hardwood, all difficult to cut, unless you're sharpening your chains very sharp, and you won't have an issue at all. Look, thanks for watching. I hope that I've addressed some of those problems. Bye for now.